Is there a place in time where logic breaks down and wonderment begins? Could that be somewhere at some time along an infinite line between the reasonable and the highly unlikely? Join us on a journey into the improbable.
Today's story, Episode 271, Recycled. Read by Alan V. Hare. Opening and closing theme by Matthew Erdman. Somewhere and sometime, a hallucination might turn out to be real. Lumo rubbed the back of his head where the medical robot had inserted the implant, feeling a small scar and lump under his skin. He hadn't noticed any changes in his perception since the operation, and wondered if he should have. As promised, the company increased his pay and transferred him from a disassembler in the scrapyard, which involved smashing old appliances apart with a hammer, to a waste processor in the new recycling plant. Lumo had walked and hitchhiked down from the north just 3 months ago, but it felt like he had been working at the yard for much longer. His friends and family in the village had told him how easy it would be to get work. However, the only jobs available turned out to be in the world's largest e-waste dump. The place was located just outside the capital on the banks of a stagnant body of water called the lagoon, where the city's wastewater treatment plant dumped its processed effluent in the hope that the occasional high tide would flush it out to the ocean. The owners had supposedly cleaned up the scrapyard when they brought in a foreign partner who built the new e-waste processing plant. So the workers no longer burnt old electronics in the open air, creating greasy black noxious clouds that floated away over the city. At least Lumo hadn't seen anyone doing it since he arrived. But large blackened areas of contaminated soil around the site still bore witness to the decades-old practice. Instead, Lumo worked in one of the cleanest spaces he had ever been in, a windowless room with rows of seats and computer equipment. His job was to remote control a robot that sorted through the ashes to extract the gold, silver, and other precious metals. With the new implant, he could see through the machine's video eyes, and its manipulator and grippers mimicked the motion of his arms and hands. The implant made the work easy, and Lumo felt lucky to be offered the job. It paid enough that he figured he could return home a rich person, in local terms. The only hard rule was to keep the bot inside the lines on the floor, which marked out its station. Moving outside them would break the connection with the bot, and require a technician in a hazmat suit to go inside and push the thing back into place. If that happened, management had told him, he'd find himself back in the yard, stripping insulation with a kitchen knife, or fired if he ever did it again. No one had ever broken the rule. After his first 12-hour shift as a processor, Lumo walked outside into the early evening. In the absence of streetlights, a path through the yard marked by old oil drums burning fridge insulation led to the makeshift housing that had developed over the years around the edge of the toxic site. "Hey, wait up!" another processing engineer yelled. He stopped and watched a woman, maybe 10 years older than him, hurry to catch up. Her dark hair was hidden under a scarf, and she wore a brightly colored dashiki over worn-out jeans. "You're the new processor?" she asked, looking him up and down critically. "Fresh from the north, too, I see." Lumo nodded, embarrassed his newbie status was so easy to spot. "Is it really that obvious? I've been here for almost 3 months, he said. "That's nowhere near long enough to rub off that northern healthy sheen," she laughed. "I'm Ashanti. What's your name?" "Lumo," Lumo said, smiling back. He liked this woman. She reminded him of his sister. "How old are you?" she asked. 17, he lied. "You're looking pretty young for 17. It must be the country air. I'm guessing management put you in the bunkhouse," Ashanti said with a wry smile. "Come on, let's go get your things. You're moving in with the rest of us processors. You can have Morowa's room. The bunkhouse is not a place for a kid." "I'm not a kid," Lumo protested. "Who's Morowa?" "She's the processor you're replacing." Morowa was one of the first to work in the new building, Ashanti explained, guiding Lumo through the maze of improvised structures made from scrap metal, scavenged wooden pallets, and old signage. "Why'd she leave such a good job?" he asked. She didn't. The company said she died in a bus accident when she went home to see her family. But I'm not so sure. She was my friend. She never said anything to me about going back north. She just disappeared one day. I miss her." Lumo nodded in sympathy, touching the back of his head. "Still hurts where they jabbed in the chip, right?" she noted. "It'll heal in a few days. Mine did. I barely think about it now." The place the processors lived was an actual residence, although it had seen better days, and Moroa's room was more like a cubbyhole. Still, Lumo was happy he didn't have to share it with anyone, and, for the first time since arriving at the scrapyard, went to sleep without being woken every few minutes by snoring. Every morning at sunrise, Lumo and Ashanti arrived at the processing building, which rose out of the scrap heaps, like a giant alien spaceship that had landed in the wrong place. The recovery technique it used wasn't any different than the outdoor fires the scrapyard had been known for. But now the toxic black clouds of burning plastic were gone, replaced by the smelter, which the company claimed exhausted air cleaner than the urban atmosphere it sucked in. The dissemblers in the yard still manually tore circuit boards out of piles of imported e-junk with chisels and hammers. Only now they threw it onto a conveyor belt fed into the perpetually hungry building. Inside, the belt led to the smelter, which dumped its ashes into the sorting room, where the processors, using remote-controlled robots, sifted through the toxic remains to pull out the unburnt chunks of precious metal. Despite the work being non-physical, he and the other processors were exhausted by the end of a shift. Management claimed it was from mental concentration, yet Lumo's arms and back often ached as they used to when he worked as a disassembler. Sore and exhausted from the day's work, he'd quickly fall asleep, but after a week, he began to dream about a life he had never lived. "We were taking my mother, I mean the mother of the woman I dream about every night, to the hospital after her accident. It had just opened, spread out over a few one-story buildings painted yellow with a silver tin roof. I can't remember the name, but we took her to emergency." Lumo explained to Ashanti one night as they sat outside their building, watching people mill about. Even at that time of night, trucks were still navigating the potholes to dump their loads of new e-waste. Sometimes, he wondered how the world could throw away that much. "So in your dreams, you have 3 brothers and a sister, and you are the oldest," Ashanti confirmed after waiting for the noisy trucks to go by. "Yes. I've never seen a father, only the mother. So everyone was freaked out when she was hurt." "Do you believe in someone?" Ashanti asked. Lumo shrugged questioningly. "Ghosts, spirits," she explained. "Do you believe in them?" "Almost everyone where I come from does." "No, why?" "I don't want to upset you. But what you've described in your dreams is Moroa's family, and the hospital sounds like the Tolan District Medical Center. Her family lived near there, and her mother got badly injured once. You're in her room, and you have her old job. Maybe her spirit is trying to communicate with you. It must have something important to say." "There's no such thing as ghosts," Lumo dismissed. "You're just reading something into my dreams that isn't there, that's all." Over the next few nights, the dreams stopped but were replaced by nightly headaches, which was why Lumo went to the company infirmary a few days later. "I'm sure it's the implant. I never get headaches, doctor," he explained. "Have you had any other symptoms?" The doctor, a bored-looking middle-aged man, asked. Lumo hesitated. "I wouldn't call them a symptom, but I've had odd dreams. They're like I'm seeing someone else's life." The doctor stopped making notes on an ancient-looking computer and looked up. "I'm going to send you to the interface technician. She'll recalibrate your implant. That should take care of the headaches." "And the dreams?" Lumo asked. "They have nothing to do with the implant," the doctor dismissed a bit too quickly. "Now your time is up. Go see the tech." After his implant was reset, the headaches disappeared, and Lumo no longer dreamed about being someone else. Ashanti was still convinced it had been Moroa's ghost trying to communicate with him, and she was disappointed when he told her the dreams had stopped. A few weeks later, Lumo was 8 hours into a shift reaching for a piece of gold slag when the connection between his implant and the processor bot he was controlling glitched. At first, he saw nothing and panicked, thinking he had lost his sight before his vision recovered, and he found himself staring at his arms, elbow deep in smelter ash, feeling for bits of metal. The air was heavy with the acrid smell of burning plastic, and clouds of toxic dust, stirred up by his hands, floated in the air, irritating his eyes. He took an involuntary breath and gagged. Then the interface glitched again, and he was in the remoter's room, his arms gesturing to control the robot. Lumo calmed himself, sank back into his chair, let the sensors in its headrest reconnect, and returned to work. "I could have sworn I was actually in the sorting room," Lumo explained to Ashanti as they walked to work a few days later. "I could smell the smoke and feel the heat from the furnace. My hands were covered in ash. It only lasted for a second, but it was so real." "I think the same thing happened once to Moroa," Ashanti said hesitantly after a moment. "I'm sure she even complained about it. That was a while ago, and Moroa never mentioned it again, and I had forgotten about it until you told me what happened to you." She stopped walking and turned to face him. "Are you having the dreams again? Were those your hands or hers when you hallucinated you were in the sorting room?" "I don't know," Lumo admitted, now unsure of what he had experienced. "But I did have a dream the night before. It was something about getting the implant and meeting you. I can't remember much. It's the first time I dreamed about her since they reset my implant." "Interesting. I wouldn't tell the company about this," Ashanti warned. "They'll reset your implant, and the dreams might go away. I still think it's Moroa's ghost, and she's trying to tell you something. Maybe we can figure it out if you start keeping a journal about the dreams." I know, Lumo, you don't believe in spirits, but they exist and they shouldn't be ignored. Try writing down the dreams for a few nights, then we'll go through them together. If there's no message, then I'm wrong and they're just, I don't know. Maybe it's all just a coincidence like you said, but shouldn't we try to find out?" Lumo finally agreed, and Ashanti found an old grade school notebook and a pen to use. "My hand!" Lumo yelled, then jumped up, and the hallucination ended as abruptly as it had started. He had been in the smelter room again, using his bare hands to sift through the ash, and had cut his palm on a sharp piece of metal, but when he looked at his hand now, it was perfectly fine. It was the third time he had hallucinated on a shift in the last week. He wanted to tell the company so they'd reset his implant again, but Ashanti had convinced him to wait until they had gone through his notebook. "These are not random," Ashanti pointed out a few nights later, putting the journal down on the rough boards balanced on oil drums that served as the residence's dinner table. It was too hot to stay inside, so they had decided to sit under the makeshift tin-roofed porch of their place to take advantage of a night breeze. A small LED hung from the rafters on recycled wires cast a dim blue light that Lumo thought made Ashanti look like a ghost. He went to pick up the journal, but Ashanti caught his hand. "When did that happen?" she demanded, turning his hand over to examine his palm. Lumo looked down in surprise but saw nothing. "I had a hallucination that I cut it on a piece of scrap in the processing room, but I just imagined it." "No, you have a fresh scar," Ashanti insisted. "Hold your hand up to the light." Lumo did as she asked, but still couldn't see any marks on his palm. "That's odd. You don't see it, do you?" she said with concern. Lumo pulled his hand away and changed the subject. "You read my dream journal. What do you think?" "Some of your dreams are hard to understand," Ashanti replied. "But I believe they're from the last few weeks of Moroa's life. She was getting sick, and I think she discovered why, and that's what she wants us to know. If you keep recording your dreams, maybe she'll tell us what happened. However, I'm starting to suspect she didn't die in a bus accident." His bot couldn't reach the big chunk of cadmium sticking out of the ash near the far edge of the sorting table, so he directed the machine to slide out of the area marked in yellow on the floor. It was against the rules, but the scrap was big enough to qualify for a bonus, so he was sure he wouldn't be reprimanded. However, even after moving, Lumo had to force the machine to reach out as far as it could without falling over. Its grapplers fumbled with the large chunk of metal, forcing him to move the bot even further. Then, suddenly, it happened. The interface glitched and Lumo found himself in the sorting room, off balance, stretching one arm toward the chunk of cadmium. The sensation was so convincing that he could feel the edge of the sorting table dig into his abdomen where he had bent over to reach the scrap. Lumo carefully pulled his hand back and looked around. He was standing in an area where the floor was painted red. A metal screen covered the walls and ceiling everywhere except the work area. Lumo had an idea and moved back to where he usually worked. The interface glitched again, and he was back in the remote room, sitting in his chair. He initiated a reconnect, dropped back into the robot's view, then intentionally had it move out of bounds. Again, he found himself in the sorting room, breathing in toxic fumes. This time, he looked down the processing line and saw his friend Ashanti mindlessly sifting through the ash a few meters away. Then beyond her, another person. Lumo raced to his friend, careful not to leave the out-of-bounds zone. She was oblivious to his presence until he shoved her out of her work area. Then, as if she had been sleepwalking, she suddenly woke up, body spasming and awareness exploding into her eyes. Shocked, she looked around, stopping at Lumo. She stumbled over her words as she grappled with what she was seeing. Your hallucination. I'm having one too, and you're in it. It's not a hallucination, he explained. Stand back in your workspace, and you'll see. He guided Ashanti back into the lines, and her eyes immediately glossed over. I don't understand, she said. What just happened? Try moving your bot out of the work area again, Luma suggested. We're not supposed to. I know, but trust me. Do it just for a few seconds. Hesitantly, Ashanti stepped into the out-of-bounds, convulsed for a second, then stared at Lumo questioningly. This is what's real. The hallucination is that we are controlling the robots, Lumo explained, pointing to the metal and wire mesh walls. I think the only places our implants can send and receive signals are where the work areas are marked out on the floor. Look, you can even see the transmitters in the ceiling above them. As soon as you step away, the signals are cut off. The dreams, Ashanti gasped with sudden realization. Morawa worked in here since the smelter was opened. She was getting sick, and we're doing the same thing. I can't explain the dreams, Lumo conceded. And I still don't believe in ghosts, but you're right. We're in the same situation as your friend. An alarm started somewhere deep in the building. The other processors immediately stopped work and began to walk away, following paths marked out on the floor. Lumo and Ashanti looked at each other. What should we do? Lumo asked anxiously, watching the last of their shift leave through a door he hadn't noticed before. He felt someone grab him by the shoulder and spun around to face 3 security guards dressed in hazmat suits. Lumo found himself strapped face down to a table in a sparse room, which he assumed by its antiseptic look was somewhere in the infirmary. He struggled to move his head and felt a dull pain at the base of his skull. There was a rustling sound, and he could just make out a technician in a white lab coat standing beside a mobile metal instrument stand. With a sharp click, the tech closed a small metal box and then placed it on the tray. He finally noticed Lumo was conscious. You're awake, he said, and began to unstrap Lumo and directed him to sit up. We removed your implant, the tech explained. I don't understand what's going on, Lumo stammered, still woozy from the drugs they had used to sedate him. You moved out of the work zone and lost contact with the control system. We told you never to do that, the tech admonished. I know, but it's not what I meant, Lumo said, his thoughts becoming more coherent. Why were we in the sorting room instead of the robots? I thought we were controlling them. Yeah, that was the original idea, the The tech chuckled without looking up from what he was doing. But the engineers who dreamed up that idiotic scheme never thought it through. Their machines lacked the dexterity to do a good job, and fixing the problem would have cost too much. It turned out to be cheaper and more efficient to tweak the implant so the operators think they are controlling the processor bots, but do the actual work. But it's toxic in the sorting room, Lumo protested, attempting to rise to his feet. His head spun, and he had to sit back down. The tech shrugged. Not everyone gets sick. Most quit before anything serious happens. They save their money and leave. Wasn't that what you were planning to do? Lumo had to admit the man was right. He would have gone home as soon as he could afford it, but he had another question burning at the back of his mind. I've been dreaming about someone who worked as a processor, then got sick and died. The tech stopped what he was doing and looked up. That's not supposed to happen, he said, growing suddenly angry. The implant's memory is flushed between users. Someone must have messed up. What do you mean? Lumo asked. The implants are expensive. We recycle them. Yours, the one I took out, was in someone else, and the person who replaces you will get it. The implant always retains some of a host's experience. It's a side effect of their operation. But we wipe their storage before they're reused. That process must have been missed. The woman who had it before me? Lumo asked angrily. Stayed too long, didn't she? And if people knew the truth? The tech didn't respond. Instead, he walked over to a cabinet, opened it, and reached for something. Lumo tried to get up again but found he was still too unstable. He grabbed the instrument tray to steady himself and noticed the small metal container the tech had placed there. While the man had his back to him, he slipped the case into his pocket and then attempted to wobble to the door. Hey you! Stop! The tech demanded, racing over to Lumo, a small needle gripped in one hand. He jabbed the thing into Lumo's shoulder. The room began spinning, and Lumo collapsed to the floor. The growling of an old diesel engine and the shrill complaints of gears in desperate need of oil woke Lumo. His eyes sprung open, and he found himself in a dank-smelling cavity with a cardboard roof. Sunlight was trying to stream in through the gaps, so he could tell he was close to the surface of whatever hole he was in. A rank stench was coming from old cans and partly torn plastic bags filled with garbage. It took a few minutes for his fogged brain to piece together that he was in a landfill. The noise was getting closer, and Lumo could feel the vibration of heavy treads. He threw the cardboard to the side and exploded out of the shallow hole to confront the battered bucket of a front-end loader about to roll over him. Taken by surprise, the driver turned, barely missing him, and stopped. Idiot! Sleeping in a dump, are you crazy? The operator yelled, then began to move the big machine again. Suddenly, Lumo understood what had happened and desperately waved his arms to get the driver to stop. Frantically, he looked around until he spotted another pile of cardboard, which looked out of place, and raced over to it. He dug through the pile until he found a shanty lying at the bottom in a shallow depression, then pulled her out and shook her awake. The front-end loader operator angrily glared at them, yelling obscenities about their intelligence. Ignoring the man, Lumo helped his friend up, and they stumbled through the garbage until they finally got to the edge of the landfill site. Neither of them recognized the city which lay beyond. Confused, they sat down on the ground to get their bearings. Lumo felt a lump in his pocket and pulled out the small metal case he had palmed from the infirmary. "What's that?" asked Ashanti. Lumo pried off the lid, then looked inside. Nestled in foam was a tiny electronic device with thin gold wires sprouting from it like the threads of a spider's web. He showed it to his friend. "Morawa's ghost," he whispered. Hey everyone! This is where we recommend new podcasts. However, this week we want to introduce you to a great newsletter for people interested in fiction. Please stay tuned for a brief message from Fiction Podcast Weekly.
If you enjoy audio drama and fiction podcasts, sign up for the Fiction Podcast Weekly. It's an email newsletter with the latest news, events, creative opportunities, job listings, behind-the-scenes production resources, podcast milestones, debuts, and finales. Plus, it's free. Sign up now at thepodcasthost.com/Fiction Podcast Weekly.
Makeshift Stories is released around the beginning and middle of the month. This month's story was written and read by Alan V. Hare. Opening and closing themes were composed and recorded by Matthew Erdman. Audio production and editing by Makeshift Studios. If you'd like to connect with us, please send an email to makeshiftstories@gmail.com or visit our website at makeshiftstories.com. Links to both are in the show notes.